I recently learned about a particular concept in game development. That is, if a game provides more tools than is necessary to tackle any given challenge, it can strengthen the sense of discovery, ownership, and reward for the player. That's because it allows the player to solve problems in creative ways using their own ideas. This is one reason immersive sims and, more broadly, so-called sandbox games are so much fun. Rather than force you into a narrow and limiting set of possibilities, sandbox games present you with a challenge, then simply lay a set of tools at your fingertips and let you just go to town. And sometimes, if this set of tools is wide enough and the game's systems are good enough, then the player's way through a game can be so unique that it becomes more than just a playstyle, but a form of self-expression. This is what Dishonored 2 has to offer. Here's a game that provides such a wide and flexible array of mechanics, weapons, and abilities, on top of levels that beg to be solved in different ways, that each waking moment in the game is a buffet of possibilities. However you approach each enemy, each obstacle, each environment, it will unquestionably be different than how another player might approach the same challenge, or even how you might approach the same challenge next time. However, the game is going on 5 years old, plus it was one of the more underplayed games of the previous generation. Is there some reason for this? Did the initial reviews get it wrong? Or did they get it right, and does this game stack up all these years later? If you're curious to find out, then I hope you'll join me for my review of Dishonored 2. If you didn't know, I recently started a second YouTube channel called Quest Mode Unscripted, where you'll find off-the-cuff impressions, opinions, hidden gem highlights, and more. If that sounds like something you're interested in, I've left the link in the description. But for now, let's get into it. First things first, I have one disclaimer about this review. While I only discuss story details that happen in the first 15 minutes of the game, I do highlight a good number of gameplay anecdotes that I experienced much later. All of these feature optional content and areas, and none of them have anything to do with the main story. However, if you'd like to play Dishonored 2 knowing as little as possible, just know that, well, you've been warned. When it comes to story, you don't need to have played Dishonored 1 to enjoy Part 2. That said, things do pick up 15 years after the first game during a ceremony to honor the anniversary of the death of Jessamine Kaldwin. If you don't know, Jessamine was the former empress whose murder you avenged in Dishonored 1. The opening scene takes place through the eyes of Emily Kaldwin, Jessamine's daughter and current holder of the throne. By her side is Corvo Attano, the main protagonist of Dishonored 1, who now serves as Emily's bodyguard. While the ceremony is supposed to honor Jessamine's memory, Corvo and Emily can't help but discuss an unfortunate and mysterious series of murders that have become the talk of Dunwall. A serial killer dubbed the Crown Killer has been targeting Emily's political opponents, and as such, the general public and even some members of Emily's inner circle have become skeptical that she and Corvo might be somehow responsible. As the ceremony begins, a mysterious woman named Delilah barges into the palace claiming to be Emily's long-lost aunt and rightful heir to the throne. Not only that, this invader seems to have command over your royal officers, and she's brought some badass mechanical soldiers, and she has magical powers. To make matters worse, she accuses Corvo and Emily of the Crown Killer murders, and everybody in attendance, well, they seem to buy it. So yeah, you've been screwed. Or rather, dishonored. Just before you're taken prisoner, that's when you have to make your first choice in Dishonored 2. Do you play as Emily or Corvo? The decision you make here will greatly affect your playthrough. Each character has a distinct set of supernatural abilities, and if you're worried about which character suits your playstyle, I would recommend doing a little research first. Or maybe wait until the section of this video where I talk about their abilities in detail. Once you do decide who to play, you're then taken prisoner and the game begins in earnest. Not only do you have to escape the palace, but once you do, you're wanted for the Crown Killer murders, and as such, your first order of business is to solve the crimes. And this sets up a really intriguing murder mystery. It also gives the opening missions a bit of a detective noir feel, which I loved. Beyond the opening bit, there's a decent revenge tale in Dishonored 2, most of which is told through either illustrated cutscenes or in dialogue. And speaking of, the voice acting in this game is fantastic, thanks to a world-class ensemble including Vincent D'Onofrio, Rosario Dawson, Sam Rockwell, Pedro Pascal, and others. To no fault of the actors, some characters are admittedly a bit forgettable, but others are fantastic. D'Onofrio's performance is excellent, and the diabolical genius inventor you meet halfway through the game, whose voice actor I'm actually unfamiliar with, is a particular standout. However, as much as it pains me to employ such an overused video game cliché, it really is true in Dishonored 2 that the most memorable characters of the entire game are hands down the environments you'll explore. First, I want to mention that this section is not about the levels within Dishonored 2. I have a whole segment later talking about the level design. Here, I want to talk about the broader world Arkane Studios has built. I have no problem saying up front, this is one of the most immersive worlds I've ever experienced in any video game. At first, things will look familiar, at least for fans of Dishonored 1, as you start off in the London-inspired city of Dunwall. But it's not long before your search for the Crown Killer leads you to another of the continent's densely populated cities, a bayside metropolis called Karnaca, where a vast majority of the game takes place. If Dunwall was a bit too gloomy for your taste, I have good news. Instead of colorless buildings set against a perpetually gray sky, the architecture of Karnaca is often sun-soaked and colored in stucco-esque pastels. And whereas Dunwall could seem at times void of any plant life, Karnaca features some genuinely colorful foliage. It all comes together for a much more Mediterranean feel. And as for the grimy, steampunk aesthetic from the first game, you'll still see some mechanical technology, but it has a much cleaner Art Deco feel. One thing the sequel retains from the first game is the stylized look of the graphics. Textures still seem as if they were pulled straight from an oil painting, and character models are still exaggerated, particularly their hands, making them look almost like tamed-down drawings from a caricature artist's sketchbook. That said, the level of detail has been massively dialed up from the first game. Textures such as skin feature pores and imperfections, while environments are far more rich in detail. Speaking of the environments, while the streets of Karnaca can appear lighter and more colorful than those in Dunwall, don't let the literal brightness fool you. In a more figurative sense, this place is just as dark or even darker than Dunwall. You'll frequently run across grotesque and tragic scenes. Maybe you'll find the body of a hopeless worker who committed suicide, or an empty apartment that's been seized and destroyed by the newly tyrannical empire. And what makes these scenes worth exploring is the way Arkane Studios has laced almost every single one of them with a story to discover. The term world building gets thrown around a lot in video games, and honestly, I often find it ambiguous and even pretentious. What does world building even mean? Well, after I explored Karnaca's streets and buildings, after I uncovered many of its secrets, I got it. This isn't just a series of areas unrelated to one another that you'll explore one to the next. It's a complete world with a more fully fleshed out backdrop than most games and heck, most books and films. Citizens often have real schedules, real concerns, and real stories to tell. More impressive, some of these stories span multiple levels across many hours of gameplay. And most impressive, at least to me, is the vast majority of this content will go undiscovered by most players. The developers just left it there, with no concern for whether you'll find it or not. Let me give you some examples. In an early mission, I ran across a random fruit stand. Exciting, I know. But there was a note from a worker writing to his partner about how he was stealing the fruit they were selling from a location called the Grand Palace, which apparently had some of the finest fruit in all of Karnaca. Little did I know the Grand Palace is a level you explore much later, and when I got there, I had totally forgotten about this note. But as I explored, I stumbled upon this unfortunate scene. I found a note here as well, and when I read it, it revealed that these poor souls were the same fruit thieves from before, who had now been caught and tortured to death as punishment. I simply paused for a moment here to appreciate that the developers had put so much effort into telling a side story that spanned nearly the entire game and that many players will never find. In another instance, I ran across an empty boat sitting in a cove. Naturally, I wanted to loot the boat. And as a side note, yes, you'll be doing a lot of looting in this game for collectibles and money to spend with merchants who sell ammo and other valuable items. Anyhow, the door to the boat that I found was locked, and I didn't have the key. Thankfully, at some point later in the same level, I discovered a woman with the key tied to her belt loop. Using the game's pickpocketing mechanic, I swiped the key right off her hip. Then I headed back to the boat. But too bad for me, some local officers beat me to the punch. The door had been broken down, and instead of a bunch of loot, I found a note addressed to the owner of the boat saying that her belongings had been confiscated and taken to an apartment just up the road. Thankfully, the note left just enough clues that I could find this apartment, and when I arrived there, I did find a few officers who I quickly dispatched. I then found the woman's belongings, which I swiped for myself. Now, this sequence alone isn't what impressed me. Being the curious player that I am, I asked myself, what if I had taken out these officers before I had headed back to the boat? Or even better, before I had even swiped the key off the woman? How would the game respond? Well, I reloaded a previous save, then visited the apartment and killed the guards before doing anything else. Sure enough, the woman's belongings weren't at the apartment because the soldiers hadn't yet raided her boat. I then went to steal the key, unlocked the boat, and yep, the door was still locked and her belongings were still there. And by the way, this is just a smaller part of a much bigger optional scenario that was playing out in that level, and changed depending on what I did and in what order. Examples like this may not sound like a big deal, but it really is impressive how many different ways you can work through this world and how doing so will result in so many drastically different experiences. It's a true sandbox, and you can dig as deep as you want or not at all. But if you do dig, you'll find plenty of surprises left by the developers, almost as a nod and a thank you for taking the time to experience the world they've built. Now, is the world perfect? Is everything worth exploring? No. In addition to the notes like the ones that I've mentioned so far, there's also a lot, and I mean a lot, of lore. Lore is discovered in books that you'll find just laying about. They contain old stories, world history, and religious texts. Things that had little to no impact on the actual gameplay. Now, I don't dislike lore at face value, but in Dishonored 2, and its prequel I might add, there's just so much of it that it eventually felt meaningless and exhausting. I quickly stopped reading it, and if you're wondering whether the lore is essential to your enjoyment of the game, I'd say absolutely not. Now, I do want to make one important point. Lore is different from notes. You'll frequently find notes on loose sheets of paper, again, just like the ones I found at the fruit stand. But what separates notes from lore is they often reveal valuable information about the world that you can act upon. Sometimes you'll discover the combination to a safe, or the location of a shortcut. Sometimes you'll even read something about a mission objective that will then be listed as a mission clue in the game's pause menu. In sum, both notes and lore are plentiful, but while lore felt dense and tedious, notes felt fun and meaningful because they were often linked to something real that I could actually discover. Before moving on, I do want to mention one more complaint I have about the World of Dishonored 2. As I've made clear, Karnaca is bleak. But one question that never really seemed to get answered was, is this grim state of affairs due to Delilah recently taking over the Empire? That seemed unlikely, given that the story doesn't take place over a particularly long period of time. Or did the city decline to this horrid state under Emily's rule? That also didn't seem to fit the overall story, given that Emily had presumably been mentored by the Honorable Corvo Attano. So why or how did Emily rule an empire into such hardship rather than prosperity? Maybe I'm reading into things too deep, maybe I missed something, or maybe I should have read all that lore after all. But I often felt that this world was given a destroyed, post-apocalyptic vibe just so the developers could build a world that was fun to explore. Despite that complaint, the world and environmental storytelling of Dishonored 2 impressed me far beyond anything I was prepared for. But enough about the world. For now, let's dig a little deeper into the gameplay. At the heart of Dishonored 2 is player choice. And despite what you may have heard, it's not just a choice between stealth and action. Though to be fair, that is one of the choices you'll frequently make. But more than that, Dishonored 2 rewards you for either killing enemies or letting them live. You'll get a report card at the end of each level that literally tells you how many enemies you've killed, and then ranks your playthrough as either high chaos, that would be highly lethal, or low chaos. That would be less lethal, or if you're up for it, completely non-lethal. Now, you might think that low chaos playthroughs require stealth, while high chaos or highly lethal playthroughs require more action-oriented play. And while that's true to an extent, low chaos runs pretty much demand stealth, high chaos runs let you play any way you want. That's because you can sneak past every enemy without engaging them once, and thanks to your long-range weaponry and close-range assassination techniques, you can also kill literally every enemy in the game without getting noticed once. In other words, you can go stealthy regardless of whether you choose high or low chaos. On the other hand, and this might be a downside for players who aren't a huge fan of stealth, action-oriented gameplay isn't quite as flexible. If you plan to frequently use your pistol, get into face-to-face knife fights, or you just don't care if enemies hear or see you, you're most likely going to end your playthrough with a fair amount of kills and hence a high chaos ranking. This, again, differs from stealth runs, which can be as lethal or non-lethal as you want. Now, don't get me wrong, action-focused playthroughs can be a ton of fun, especially if you've already played the game once and you know the levels, including shortcuts, vantage points, and enemy placement. But these playthroughs just don't offer the variety, nor do they demand the creativity of stealth runs. For me, as a die-hard stealth fan, this was just fine. I prefer finding creative ways to sneak past undetected rather than blasting my way through, and Dishonored 2 embraces the ingenuity that trying to go completely unnoticed can require. Now, if you're not a stealth fan, know that Dishonored 2 never locks you into playing one way or the other. You can always say to hell with it and turn any sneak fest into a bloodbath. It's totally up to you. Choosing high or low chaos also affects more than just how you play the game. It also affects the world itself. The more enemies and NPCs you kill on a high chaos run, the more the characters in the main story will become cynical of your actions. You'll see this play out in dialogue. Going high chaos will also result in a darker ending to the story, and on this I have one word of advice. Don't choose high or low chaos just because you want a particular ending. Instead, just pick the playstyle that sounds like the most fun and live with the ending that you get. This game is at its most rewarding when you discover and use the tactics that are the most fun for you. The next effect of choosing either high or low chaos has to do with certain pests that flutter throughout the city of Karnaca. They're called bloodflies, and similar to the plague rats that infested Dunwall, bloodflies feast on human corpses, so the more enemies you kill, the more bloodflies you'll encounter later in the game. And yes, bloodflies can kill you. However, I do want to mention that I played both high and low chaos, and I never found the increase in bloodflies to be all that noticeable. It was there, but it never significantly increased the challenge, and I wished it was more pronounced. That said, I did notice some changes to the world on my run where I was a mass-murdering maniac. In one instance, I found an office that had a nest of bloodflies and a corpse hanging from the rafters. In my low chaos playthrough, the same office was completely empty. No bloodflies, no corpse. Again, this didn't really affect the level of challenge, but it was cool to see how leaving a trail of bodies can affect the world. However, the most impactful effect of choosing one playstyle over any other is that no matter your choice, it will force you to approach the levels in different ways. Dishonored 2, more than perhaps any other game I've played, creates completely, and I mean completely different experiences for not just different players, but also for the same player who chooses to play through the game multiple times. For example, getting through a level with 0 kills and 0 detections mean you'll obviously have to stay very quiet. You might want to look for carpet to step on rather than hard, noisy surfaces. You'll want to literally stay in the shadows. You'll also want to constantly look up, not for enemies, but for rafters, rooftops, and balconies that offer hidden routes past enemies. On stealth runs, you'll also want to hide bodies so enemies don't become suspicious and search for you. On the other hand, should you go for a high chaos run, you might not care as much if enemies see you. Rather than searching for clever ways through areas, you might instead want to focus more on mastering your combat-related weapons, gadgets, and abilities. This is just one reason that playing Dishonored 2 more than once is not just fun, but revelatory. It's pretty great to experience one level one way, then play it again only to realize you didn't discover even half of what that level had to offer on your first go-around. So, however you decide to play Dishonored 2, what are the actual mechanics like? Well, I'll talk about the combat mechanics a bit later when I get into weapons and abilities, but I do want to take a moment to talk about stealth overall. Again, I'm a huge fan of stealth, but in Dishonored 2, it actually took me a while to get used to. Unlike many other games in the genre, such as, say, the recent Hitman games, enemies in Dishonored 2 are actually pretty unpredictable. Say you throw a bottle to distract a soldier. He will investigate, but not along the same path every single time. This matters because stealth often requires trial and error. Every encounter in Dishonored 2, even multiple encounters with the same exact enemy, will likely be different. At first I found this disappointing. I like to learn and memorize enemy patterns, but I soon found this unpredictability made the game more interesting. Instead of relying on patterns, I had to rely on my own reflexes and ability to improvise. And this was a challenge because enemy AI in Dishonored 2, while not genius level, is for the most part pretty decent. Enemies' lines of sight aren't limited to a super narrow vision cone, and their hearing is also pretty sharp. Even if you stay up high out of their line of sight, running along a noisy metal roof might still give away your location. Ultimately, Dishonored 2 offers a pretty challenging stealth experience. In fact, I started my first playthrough on the hard difficulty setting but dialed it back after I got frustrated. On the normal difficulty setting, this became one of the most, if not the most rewarding stealth game I've ever played. Getting that low chaos ranking at the end of each level with 0 detections and 0 kills often took a significant number of hours, but those hours always flew by. This is thanks largely to the game's convenient quick save option. Whether you're staying quiet or blasting everyone in the face, you can always open the pause menu and quickly save your game with the press of a button. This is nothing new to stealth games, but it does let you trial and error your way through any encounter. Now, to keep this review honest, I do want to mention that stealth, particularly the enemy AI, isn't perfect. Sometimes enemies would spot me from afar out of the corner of their eye. But on a few occasions, and I do mean just a few, they seemed literally blind to the fact that I was almost right in front of them. Again, this was infrequent, but it did break my immersion a time or two. Okay, so that's stealth. What should players expect who are a little more trigger happy? As I mentioned earlier, it's tough to dive deep into the combat mechanics of Dishonored 2 without looking at the arsenal of weapons, gadgets, and abilities the game leaves at your disposal. So, without further ado, as I mentioned much earlier, the very first choice you'll make in Dishonored 2 is which character you'll play as, Emily Kaldwin or Corvo Attano. They are different from one another, but let's first look at their weapons, which are actually identical. The first weapon you'll get is a single-shot pistol, which of course makes a lot of noise and can kill most enemies at close range in 1, 2, or sometimes 3 shots. This obviously makes stealth tough, and on my first 2 playthroughs, which were based entirely around stealth, I didn't use the pistol once. And on a side note, just the fact that the gun, which in many games would be your most used weapon, isn't even necessary to beat the game, I think shows the level of flexibility you'll find in this game. It really doesn't force anything on you. Anyhow, on my third playthrough where I basically went through the game as a wrecking ball, the pistol became very, very handy. That said, don't expect an advanced first-person shooter here. First off, this is the only gun you'll get in the entire game if you don't count the crossbow, and second, you can't aim down sights, so it's shoot from the hip or nothing. Don't get me wrong, the pistol never failed me, but the mechanics just felt basic. Point, shoot, kill, repeat. A much more interesting weapon, and the weapon I used most throughout all of my playthroughs, was the crossbow. It's mostly silent, and it can be loaded with a variety of bolts. Standard bolts are lethal with a well-aimed headshot, while sleep darts let you render enemies unconscious. And then there are bolts that allow you to get more strategic, like howling bolts, which blind enemies for a short time, and stinging bolts, which cause enemies to flee an area. Basically, the crossbow is a microcosm of Dishonored 2's gameplay. It's handy and works great for high chaos runs, but it becomes far more useful and frankly more fun during stealth runs regardless of whether you're playing high or low chaos. Want to sneak past a group of enemies undetected? Use sleep darts or a howling bolt. Want to freely explore an area that's swarming with soldiers? Use a stinging bolt to make them run away. Or if you just want to do things the old-fashioned way, again while staying quiet, just use regular old bolts. Then there's your knife. Similar to the crossbow, I found the knife to be much more useful for sneaky assassinations, creeping up behind enemies to slice them to death in some brutal fashion. But should you get into a melee scuffle, action fans will be happy to know that Dishonored 2 does have a pretty decent parry mechanic. Simply press the parry button at the right moment and you'll knock your enemy off balance and open them up for a nasty, and I do mean nasty, one-hit kill. This is not only fun, it allows you to take on multiple enemies at once with just your blade. Another element that makes the knife more useful is the game's scarcity of ammo. It's not scarce like in, say, survival horror games, but if you just shoot everything that moves, you will run out of ammo, and pretty fast. Adding one more layer of depth to the combat, even if it is rather thin, is that you can upgrade your weapons throughout the game. To do this, simply search for the blueprints scattered throughout each level, then bring them to one of the game's merchants who will upgrade your weapons for a price. To be honest, most of these upgrades were rather minimal, upgraded ammo capacity here, faster reload speeds there, stuff like that. But searching for blueprints did make exploring the levels, which was already a blast, even more fun. If I haven't made it clear yet, face-to-face combat in this game is just not as deep as stealth. Even if you're not necessarily trying to sneak around, taking a more calculated approach in a high chaos run allows for more creative scenarios that I just found to be more satisfying. This is of course thanks in part to the game's wide variety of supernatural abilities, which I talk about soon, but it's also thanks to a few of the gadgets at your disposal. You do have grenades, which, let's be honest, are always a good time, but what if you want to set a trap? Well, lay down a stun mine, which puts your enemies to sleep, or a spring razor, which is basically a deadly shrapnel mine. Place either in a narrow hallway, then simply get out of the way and watch as enemies who investigate either get put to sleep or death. Now, don't get me wrong, I get that setting traps, putting enemies to sleep, parrying, and stabbing enemies from behind, none of this is groundbreaking. In fact, if Dishonored 2 was limited to its material weapons, it would be average at best. It's when you combine the steel at your fingertips with all of the fun supernatural stuff you can do that the flexibility and versatility of Dishonored 2's moment-to-moment gameplay really shines through. You're probably noticing a pattern here. That is, the more I talk about Dishonored 2, the more I mention how many ways you can play the game. Well, when you take into account each character's supernatural abilities, your options multiply even more. You gain these abilities by finding what are called runes, collectibles hidden throughout each level that can be spent in your powers menu to unlock abilities and their upgrades. As I've mentioned, while Emily and Corvo have unique abilities that make each distinct from one another, they also have some abilities that are very similar, or even identical. There's Dark Vision, which lets you see enemies through walls. Corvo and Emily also both have a teleportation ability, though it does vary slightly for each character, particularly when upgraded. Basically, both characters can choose a location within a set distance and instantly cross that distance without making a sound or without being seen, even if you cross directly through an enemy's line of sight. This also lets you easily reach high up or far away platforms, balconies, and rooftops. Your teleportation ability alone makes navigating and sneaking around Dishonored 2's gigantic and ingenious sandbox environments an absolute joy. So, what makes Emily and Corvo different? Well, some of the coolest abilities in the game. Maybe even in any game. Take Domino, which allows Emily to link up to 4 enemies within a short distance of one another, causing them to share whatever fate you decide. Once 2, 3, or 4 enemies are linked, should you kill one, you kill them all. Shoot one with a sleep dart, and they all pass out. Then there's Doppelganger, which allows Emily to summon a clone of herself to distract enemies. Or Mesmerize, which allows you to cast this big purple glimmering thing that transfixes enemies nearby, causing them to become completely oblivious to anything going on around them. You can either walk right by, stab them in the back, or choke them all out. As always, the choice is yours. And check out Shadow Walk, which lets Emily morph into this spooky and more stealthy shadow form so she can sneak up on enemies with even more speed and silence. In my playthroughs, especially my stealthy runs, Mesmerize was particularly useful, but Domino was the most fun, especially when combined with the crossbow. You can even combine 2 or more abilities for some really fun effects. With Domino and Doppelganger together, you can force an enemy soldier to kill not only themselves, but 2 of their fellow soldiers simultaneously. Start by linking 3 enemies with Domino. Then summon a nearby clone of yourself using Doppelganger. If you're quick, you can link your clone with the other linked enemies, then just watch as the linked guards go after your clone. When one of them kills it, this will cause them to kill themselves and the 2 other linked guards. Now, is this practical? Not really, but it shows how creative you can get. I can't tell you how many times I had an idea for how to reach some distant location or take out a particular enemy in a certain way. Then I'd think, that's a cool idea, but I probably can't do that. But then I'd try it, and sure enough, things played out exactly as I'd planned. It really feels like the developers thought of everything. And I haven't even talked about Corvo's abilities. His standout, at least for me, was Possession. This lets you possess and literally control rats, fish, and bloodflies. Want to sneak out of an area that's crowded with enemies? Possess a rat and scurry away. However, be careful because enemies will stomp a rat if they get close enough. I told you the developers thought of everything. Oh, and Possession allows for one of the coolest navigational mechanics in the entire game. As with Dishonored 1, if you see a broken ventilation grate nearby, you can possess a rat and scurry through to see where the vent leads. And if you possess a fish, you can swim through gates in canals or drains in fountains, which often lead to other areas that might be difficult to access in human form. And as I've mentioned, you can upgrade abilities using the runes you find throughout the levels. Upgrade Possession, and you can even possess other humans, including enemy soldiers. I'm tempted to explain why this is so handy, but I think it's best to let you explore, experiment, and discover for yourself. Now, I feel like I'm out of breath and I've only talked about one of Corvo's abilities. I didn't even mention that you can possess dead bodies, another great way to give enemies the slip. It really is amazing how much you can do. And if you think I'm revealing or spoiling too much, I spent 76 hours over all of my playthroughs and I didn't even unlock some abilities because I was having too much fun with the ones I did unlock. Want to slow down time? Yeah, Corvo has an ability for that too. And going back to the fact that you can upgrade abilities, these are more than simple enhancements. Sometimes upgrades felt like entirely new abilities. Take Emily's teleport. Upgrade it and she gains the power of telekinesis. While you can still instantly send your body across a room or an alleyway, you can now also pull valuable items towards you. Now, one thing some players might view as a downside is that unless you really scour each level for all the runes that I mentioned earlier, those are the items that you spend to unlock and upgrade abilities. Unless you find them all, you won't be able to unlock and fully upgrade each ability. There are simply too many powers and not enough runes. But that's okay because, like I said, you'll likely gravitate towards the powers that fit your playstyle and leave the rest at the door. Thankfully for me, my arsenal always felt complete even if I was only using half the tool set laid out at my fingertips. One thing I haven't mentioned is that in addition to your abilities, you can also upgrade your character. Both Emily and Corvo have slots for what are called bone charms. Like runes, bone charms are hidden throughout the world as collectibles. Each bone charm has a specific upgrade. One might let you hold your breath longer underwater, and another might reduce fall damage. But as helpful as they sound, I never found the improvements from bone charms to be all that helpful or noticeable. There's also a rudimentary crafting system that lets you craft new and more powerful bone charms. But ultimately for me, bone charms and the upgrades they provided were probably the most superfluous parts of the entire game. That said, like blueprints, just finding bone charms did provide a nice incentive to fully explore each area. Unlike bone charms, the core character abilities, whether I was disguising myself as a rat, stopping time, or using Domino to assassinate 4 enemies all at once, these were absolutely essential to the Dishonored 2 experience. However, there's one more layer of the game that encourages you to delve even deeper into the realm of experimentation. What's most impressive about the levels in Dishonored 2 isn't how they look or sound, though they do look and sound pretty darn good. It's that each level was built to accommodate every possible playstyle, all without punishing the player for choosing to play one way or the other. But before I get into the environments themselves, I want to talk about the overall mission structure. In each level, you have core mission objectives that are both marked on your HUD and recorded in the game's pause menu. Now, if I haven't already mentioned, if you really know your way around, you can breeze through each mission, and indeed each entire level, very quickly if you don't care about stealth, and you just bounce from one objective marker to the next. But as for me, I always took my time, and I never regretted doing so. It always seemed like the game had my particular playstyle in mind. That's because each level is meticulously, and I mean meticulously designed to make sure that whether you play stealthy, guns blazing, lethal or non-lethal, or anywhere in between, you'll always find a fun way to tackle each challenge. From a development standpoint, this is truly remarkable. Every building, courtyard, and alleyway had to be thought of from 2, 3, or even more angles. Each area is navigable using teleportation, without teleportation, while remaining completely undetected, or while moving in plain sight, as Emily or as Corvo. Heck, Dishonored 2 even offers an option early on to play the entire game without any supernatural abilities. I played this way on my 3rd playthrough, and it forced me to explore the levels in completely new ways that were honestly pretty mind-blowing. That balcony on the 4th level of some office building that you teleported to on your first playthrough? Yeah, there's a way to get up there on foot. Some alternate routes may be obvious, and others will be really difficult to find. For example, the first level of the game might seem pretty straightforward, and if you stick to the main path, it is. But I can think of at least 3 ways through the entire level, one of which has about 3 branching paths of its own. And another will get you through about half of the level without encountering a single enemy. Once you discover how just one shortcut can so drastically impact an entire level, that's when the game instills a sense of curiosity. What else can you discover? What did the developers hide? What's up on that rooftop? If you can see a spot that seems like you can get there, chances are you can. And once you do, you'll probably find something worthwhile. And as I've alluded to, few, if any, players will discover everything on their first playthrough. I never felt that compelled to play through the first Dishonored game more than once. But when it comes to the sequel, I immediately jumped in for my 2nd and 3rd runs. Having gained the knowledge of shortcuts, vantage points, and enemy placement, plus knowing that using a new character with new moves would lead me to discover even more, playing through the game again and again was too tantalizing of a proposition to resist. And the game didn't disappoint. In an early level on my first playthrough, I wandered through a ransacked old building and noticed an area inside that seemed suspiciously just out of reach. I couldn't figure out how to get there. But hey, maybe this was a rare instance of an area that truly was off limits. But then, on my third playthrough, some 60 hours of gameplay later, I found a completely new route through the same level. Once that path led me back to the main area of the level, I realized I had stumbled directly into that area that seemed impossible to reach on my first playthrough. I think I've mentioned it before, but these aha moments are everywhere in Dishonored 2, if you take the time to find them. On a later level, I wandered into another abandoned building. This time, it was an apartment. Once I got all the way up to the third level, I found one of the game's collectibles, a bone charm, which would have satisfied me enough to head back to the main part of the level, but then I noticed an open balcony that led to a building across an alleyway. But remember, I was 3 stories up and this was on my run through the game with no superpowers, so I couldn't just teleport to the building across the way, which just happened to be the building I was supposed to infiltrate from the ground level as part of my main objective. Anyhow, without any supernatural abilities, I tried to carefully jump across the alleyway, and sure enough, I stuck the landing. And when I scaled the rest of the building and arrived at the top, it was as if the level designers were expecting me. There I found an open skylight providing an easy, stealthy way into the lower levels of the building far below. Not only that, but there was a conveniently placed enemy right below the skylight who I could now pounce on using the game's aerial assassination mechanic. The way these alternate routes reward you with fun moments of gameplay and the way they make you feel clever and cunning was one of the most rewarding parts of Dishonored 2. And as a side note, I don't think it's an accident that there was a collectible so close to such an important shortcut. Collectibles are scattered throughout levels, and if you use a certain item that's given to you at the beginning of the game, you can actually see the general location of collectibles on your HUD. This is a clever way of the level designers to lure curious players off the beaten path. And once you get there, once you find the collectible you're looking for, it's up to you to explore further and find less obvious discoveries. Levels also encourage and reward exploration through their side quests. In one level, a shopkeeper asked me to find his assistant who had gone missing after trying to steal a valuable item from a secured vault at a set location in the level. This led me to the assistant's apartment, which was itself an entirely optional area. However, it was from this apartment that I then discovered a completely unguarded shortcut into the level's main area. And this was just one of at least 4 ways into the main area that I can think of off the top of my head. And then there are the game's assassination missions. Most levels require you to assassinate one major target, usually a pivotal character in the story. But here's the twist. Every assassination target can be taken out lethally, but also non-lethally. This was a mechanic in Dishonored 1, and like in that game, figuring out how to take the non-lethal approach will require additional creativity. If the idea of turning an assassination into more of a puzzle sounds like your idea of fun, this is the route you'll want to take. All in all, the way missions are structured, combined with the branching environments and the examples of world building that I talked about much earlier, it all comes together to create some incredibly engaging and rewarding levels. Before I wrap things up, there's one level in particular that I want to talk about, and it's one of the most impressive levels I've ever seen in a video game. You may have heard of it. It's called the Clockwork Mansion, and well, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. This is a mansion that literally transforms right before your eyes. Find a lever within a room, and when you pull it, that room will begin to shift, revealing its mechanical underworkings, and eventually change into a completely different room. Each time you do this, you'll open up at least one new pathway. And it all seems real. Gears turn, hinges interlock, and the entire building feels as if it was built from actual blueprints. And for all I know, maybe it was. And as with the rest of the game, how you get through this mansion is totally up to you. You can even work your way through the entire level without pulling a single lever or transforming a single room. I wouldn't recommend doing that on your first time through, but on subsequent runs, it's definitely a fun challenge. And this isn't the only level that took me by surprise. I'm tempted to end this video by showing another of my favorite levels, which puts another major twist on the gameplay, but I think it's best for you to discover that one all for yourself. And that is my review of Dishonored 2. So, is this game a masterpiece? I suppose that depends on whether you show up for an action game or a stealth game. It's definitely not an action masterpiece, not by a long shot. However, is Dishonored 2 a stealth masterpiece? Absolutely yes. This is without a doubt one of the best stealth sandboxes I've ever played. And with that, I want to thank you for watching this entire video. If you enjoyed it, give me a thumbs up, and if you didn't, give me a thumbs down. If you want to keep up with me and see what I'm playing, you can follow me on Twitter at Quest Mode Games. And if you want more content just like this, maybe subscribe or even check out my other YouTube channel, Quest Mode Unscripted, where I talk about all things video games completely, well, unscripted and off the cuff. I also want to thank my Boss Mode patrons, Brock and Bare Knuckle Bob. If you'd like to support my content on Patreon, you'll find the link in the description below. Finally, I want to remind everyone to never stop questing.